Thanks very much to Marlena Laurel, the Central Asian Studies Program here at George Washington, for inviting me to share a few thoughts with you this afternoon on a topic that I've been spending a lot of time with in the last 5-6 years, and one that I think is of really, truly historic significance. And what's happening, and I'm going to put things in a bit longer historical framework and also in a larger geographic framework. When we talk about Eurasian integration, when I talk about Eurasia, I'm not talking about the former Soviet Union or the post-Soviet space. I'm talking about the supercontinent of Eurasia, from Europe to Asia, from Siberia to India, including the greater Middle East and Southeast Asia. What the British geographer Halford Mackinder would have called 100 years ago the world island. It's reconnecting. It's reconnecting right now. That is the big thing that is happening. Now, of course, Eurasia was connected up until about 500 years ago in the period of the Silk Road days. And the Silk Road, the term is kind of a misnomer because it really was a network of trading routes that connected South Asia to Europe, to the greater Middle East, to East Asia, that connected the greater Middle East and Europe to East Asia. And there was no plan about how this developed. It developed basically according to market principles, and it put Central Asia and the broader Caspian Basin right at the center of this world for a period of 500, more than for hundreds of years, maybe a thousand years, depending upon how you calculate. But Fred Starr, in a new book this year called Lost Enlightenment, has really captured in great detail. And when I say great detail, I mean great detail. Very, very rich book about the scientific, the artistic, the cultural achievements that were taking place from a period of 750 to 1150, kind of the Renaissance period, if you will, in Central Asia, in which this region, in these areas of human inquiry and knowledge, were far ahead of Europe at the time, and frankly far ahead of most of the rest of the world. And what those sorts of achievements, this period of remarkable human achievement, was facilitated because they were hugely prosperous. And they were prosperous because they were at the center of these trading routes for hundreds of years. Some of the biggest cities in the world at that time, Balkh, Merv, and others, were located in this region. And I was reminded of this richness in a visit to India at the end of August, when I spent time in Delhi and Chennai, formerly Madras. And sometimes terms that you've known all your life, but you see in a different way when you're actually in a different place, like the linguistic, the Euro-Indian linguistic group.
Indo-European.
Indo-European, thank you very much. Suffering a little bit of jet lag from just coming back from Russia a couple of days ago. Indo-European, thank you very much. Well, Indo-European, what does it mean? It means that India was connected to Europe. Languages of Sanskrit and German are actually quite close linguistically. And why is that? It's because those two regions of the Eurasian supercontinent were connected. They were connected through these trading ties, and it brought a lot of cultural, educational ties, etc. with it. Now, the connectivity broke down, as we know, about 500 years ago with the advent of sea trade and also political conflicts that took place over the course of hundreds of years. The Cold War was a particularly anomalous period of disconnectivity. If you think about it, in the Cold War, the Soviet Union, or Russia, China, and India, the three largest countries of Eurasia, were relatively not integrated into the world trading system. They were fairly isolated. The three largest economies of the Eurasian continent, unless you were to put together the EU as a whole. Well, obviously that began to change in the late 1970s with the Chinese opening. And then it accelerated in the early 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the breakdown of borders, and the introduction of market principles as more of a guiding force in the development of the Russian and other regional economies. And then India as well, with the reforms that took place in the middle 1990s. Here's a phenomenon that's quite extraordinary. 20 years ago, there was Sino-Indian trade was so marginal, it was less than $500 million a year. Today, that trade is, China is India's largest trade partner, more than $100 billion a year. So that's more than 30x growth in the course of 20 years. Now that's a major phenomenon that has an impact on political calculations in both Delhi and in Beijing. And I'll get back to towards the end of my remarks. Now, we did, first of all, this notion of a Silk Road. With all due respect to Secretary Clinton and her speech in Shanghai in July of 2011, it's not an American idea. And in fact, attaching it to Afghanistan, it really is an Afghan idea. And it goes back to the first Afghan national development strategies that were talked about going back to 2005, 2006. The United States was relatively kind of a latecomer in this. I got attracted to this quite accidentally, but it was when we did some studies of the Northern Distribution Network back at CSIS beginning in early 2009. One of my colleagues had a dinner with General Petraeus in January of 2009, just after he'd gotten back from Central Asia, and was starting to negotiate the new transit corridors to supply our troops in Afghanistan, which subsequently became called the Northern Distribution Network. To study, I thought, yeah, that'd be an interesting thing to study. What attracted me to it, though, was it would get a handle on what I had a sense of was this much larger phenomenon happening in the Eurasian continent, how these new trade transit corridors and development and this reconnecting process that was going on. If Afghanistan can be accessible to commerce, and it's important to know that when we're supplying our troops in theater, more than 85% of what we supply our troops with are non-lethal goods. Those non-lethal goods are all supplied by commercial carriers. Before the NDN came into place, all of those non-lethal goods were coming through the port of Karachi and going across the AFPAC border through the Turkmenistan gates. They were traveling virtually through enemy territory. It's like, wow, enemy territory. How's it getting through? Well, basically, those people, they're on both sides of the border, they made money. They were making calculations about, well, maybe it's more in my interest, my family's interest, that I facilitate this trade rather than block this trade, blow up this trade, or steal this trade. That's the concept. And for General Petraeus at the time, and I talk about this because it's very fundamental in understanding, I think, the key principles in how these new trade and transit corridors are developing. The problem from a military standpoint is we were dependent upon one ground block of communication, that one corridor. And going back to 2008, 2009, we're looking at one, much greater demand because of an increased military presence in Afghanistan, and also concerns about being overly leveraged to the port operators in Karachi, the trucking industry in Pakistan, etc. So you create competition. You can have more throughput, and plus you get different countries trying to compete to be part of this network. Competition, that's what's fundamental about this. We took a trip down to CENTCOM in May of 2009 to talk with them. They were really thrilled to talk to somebody from Washington that actually cared about or was even aware of the Northern Distribution Network they were doing. And the route that the CENTCOM people were most excited about would have gone through what country? Iran. Why Iran? It's the straightest shot. You already had port infrastructure built. That would be the easiest way to do it. But obviously, for political reasons, we can't do that. And in fact, when the U.S. government talks about New Silk Road, we can't even talk about Iran. Iran actually has very serious interests in the New Silk Road. 4 years ago at the Regional Economic Cooperation Conference for Afghanistan that was held, part of now what is the sort of the Heart of Asia process, was held in Istanbul. I sat next to the Iranian representative. I talked to him a little bit about our ideas about, thinking about the lessons from the NDN, applying them and thinking about them in a modern Silk Road context, now called the New Silk Road. Of course, the Iranians are very enthusiastic about it. The Iranians have been doing a lot on this front for years, building connectivity from Iran through into Western Afghanistan, of course, Herat. And the Central Asian states as well are quite interested in this concept. I was just in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan earlier this year, and a new railhead is being completed. Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Iran. This is very important for the Central Asians to be able to have access to the sea. This is their easiest access to the sea. Now, the connectivity between Central Asia and South Asia is very important, and the Indians are extremely enthusiastic about this. From an Indian perspective, again, for hundreds of years, thousands of years, India was connected to its north. Basically, about 200 years ago, when the British Empire and the Russian Empire met each other, that sort of established this horizontal east-west line that blocked off India's connectivity to much of other regions on the Eurasian continent. They would very, very, very much like to break through this. And I think there's an important development that took place this September in Dushanbe, the decision of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to expand its membership to include India, Pakistan, other members, Mongolia, possibly Turkey, and certainly Iran is very clear that it wants to join the organization. And someday, hopefully, in the not-too-distant future, when it's not under a sanctioned regime, then it would be eligible to join. But this expansion of the membership of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I think, is a development that could be of great significance. If you think about the possibilities for economic cooperation in a broader Eurasian framework in which Central Asia is at the heart, and also for security cooperation, thinking about the future of Afghanistan as the American military presence is smaller. I think with the expanded membership, it creates a possibility for the organization to play a greater role. Now, this may sound kind of counterintuitive because you say, wait a second, when you get more members in an organization, doesn't it make it usually more difficult for the organization to reach consensus about anything? And especially an organization with such diverse membership as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, how are India and Pakistan, enemies for the most? They regard each other as enemies. How is that going to make the organization function more easily? Well, it may not. But the reason why I would say why it may is because the Russians have been reluctant for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to do much. Why? Because they see the organization as an extension of Chinese domination and political influence. And that makes them feel, I think, somewhat awkward, somewhat insecure about the organization. They find that two other large members in there, especially India, a longtime ally and traditional friend of Moscow, is there. I think this may dilute, to some extent, Russian opposition to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization being more active in this area. Now, let's leave you with this one kind of larger thought that I've been puzzling over for the last 5-6 years as we, at CSIS where I work, where we've been studying this Eurasian integration phenomenon. The phenomenon, as Deputy Assistant Secretary Sumar rightly said, it's fundamentally driven by private sector activities. It's economic forces that are driving this, and primarily what's behind those economic forces are private sector interests. Now, in some countries, the private sector and the state sector can be a little bit harder to separate, but nevertheless, I would stand by that contention. So, and the process of this connectivity, it's taking place as we sit here. It's been taking place for years. Some of you have seen my presentations on this in the past, I usually use a graphic. And it's a graphic, it was a 1999 formerly classified, now unclassified graphic of satellite telecommunications activity throughout the world, one day in 1999. And what you see in the graphic is, throughout the northern hemisphere, it's all black, i.e. it's filled in. There's a lot of activity. There's a lot of connectivity. There's one relatively white spot, one relatively empty spot. Probably the epicenter of that empty spot would be the Afghanistan-Tajikistan border, right around there. Central Eurasia, if you will. Relatively disconnected, as we know, the most disconnected part of the world. But it's getting filled in, and it's been getting filled in. And the question is, to what extent does that process need for its facilitation some kind of organization or institutional framework to support it? or to what extent will it continue to happen in a more kind of what Adam Smith would call the free hand? I don't have an answer to the question. It's an interesting one to look at in its development. And just the last thought to leave you with, to emphasize something else that Mrs. Sumar said. You know, what is the greatest obstacle to this connectivity? And this is one of the big things we discovered in our NDN studies, and anyone who's studied logistics and trade and transit knows this very well. But it was interesting to see, because you think of, well, what would people think would be the biggest obstacles to transit of commercial goods into Afghanistan? Lack of infrastructure? Well, okay, there's almost no railroad in Afghanistan. Railroad was consciously not built in Afghanistan because Afghan leadership more than 100 years ago was concerned that that would facilitate Russian and/or English domination of Afghanistan. No, that's not the biggest obstacle. Okay, well, what about physical insecurity? Well, that's an obstacle as well, but it's not the biggest one. The biggest obstacle is basically borders acting as toll booths. It's all the institutional, bureaucratic drags on the predictability of the cost and the time of delivery. As Mrs. Sumar said, cost and time are the critical factors, but also that is predictability. Private sector actors need to have confidence about how long it's going to take and how much it's going to cost for things to get through. And that gets to the fundamental problem of institutional problems, political problems within countries, between countries, and that's what's going to be key for Central Asian countries and the Central Asian region to play a much bigger role into the future in the development of these transit corridors. Thanks.